They used to laugh at it. That's what American pilots kept hearing when the Hellcat first entered combat in the Pacific. Japanese pilots mocked it over the radio. Their intelligence officers wrote that it was slow, heavy, and hopeless against the Zero. Even some U.S. crews doubted it. The F6F Hellcat looked like a bulldozer with wings, thick, rugged, and anything but graceful. The Zero was everything the Hellcat wasn't: light, agile, elegant, and deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot. For years, it had dominated the skies with terrifying efficiency. So when the Hellcat arrived, most Japanese pilots assumed it would be just another slow American target, another clumsy machine they could dance around and shoot down at will. But then, the reports started. Strange reports. Zero pilots began claiming the Hellcat was accelerating far faster than before, climbing harder, holding power longer, and cutting into fights it had once been too slow to enter. Some Japanese squadrons even filed complaints. The Hellcat is not the same aircraft. Impossible for it to gain speed like this. They believed the Americans had secretly redesigned it. They hadn't. The airframe was unchanged. The engine was unchanged. The pilots were the same. What had changed was something no Japanese pilot could see: a hidden advantage inside the fuel tanks. This is the story of the secret fuel mix that turned America's slow Hellcat into the Zero killer the Japanese never saw coming. Before the secret fuel mix ever touched a Hellcat's engine, the aircraft was already fighting a quieter battle, one not against the Japanese, but against doubt. Even before its first real dogfight, the F6F had to prove it wasn't just another heavy American machine built to take hits rather than give them. On the ground, Hellcat crews admired its strength. It was rugged, overbuilt, and forgiving. Pilots said it felt like climbing into a steel safe with wings. But in the air, where agility, acceleration, and climb rate mattered most, the Hellcat struggled to shake off its reputation. Japanese pilots had built a myth around the Zero. To them, it wasn't just a fighter, it was a symbol of Japanese engineering superiority. Lightweight, elegant, extremely maneuverable, it embodied everything the Hellcat wasn't. The Zero could flip, roll, and climb in ways that American pilots found almost unnatural. In early combat reports, U.S. pilots described the Zero as a bird made of smoke, something impossibly light, infinitely agile, and terrifying in its precision. The Hellcat, by comparison, was built with a different philosophy. Survive the hit, give the pilot a second chance, and use raw engine power to stay in the fight. But surviving wasn't winning, and in the Pacific, America needed a winner. Intelligence analysts at the time knew something critical. If the Hellcat couldn't outclimb or out-accelerate the Zero during the first 20 seconds of an engagement, the battle usually tilted heavily in Japan's favor. This opening burst, the moment both sides pushed their throttles forward, decided who owned the sky. And this was exactly where the Zero held its deadliest advantage. Engineers at Grumman knew the Hellcat's engine, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, could outperform the Zero. On paper, it produced more horsepower, more torque, and could operate at higher pressures. But the real limitation wasn't the engine, it was the fuel. The standard 100-130 octane aviation gasoline used across U.S. bases was reliable, widely available, and safe enough for long-distance naval operations. But it wasn't capable of supporting the extreme manifold pressures the R2800 could theoretically reach. If pilots pushed the throttle too far on standard fuel, the results were disastrous. Detonation, overheating, blown cylinders, or catastrophic engine failure. So Hellcat pilots flew with a leash, an invisible one. They had a powerful machine, but were allowed to use only a fraction of what the engine could really deliver. Meanwhile, Zero pilots had no such restriction. Their lightweight aircraft didn't rely on turbochargers or high-pressure superchargers. Their engines demanded less fuel quality and reached peak performance without the risks Hellcat pilots faced. In the spring of 1943, American commanders realized a hard truth. No amount of pilot training, tactical revision, or aircraft modification would bridge the gap. The Hellcat needed more power, real, usable power, not on paper, but in the air. That power, they would soon discover, was trapped behind a chemical barrier, one hidden inside every barrel of American aviation fuel. And unlocking it would change everything.
The breakthrough began in a lab, not a hangar, not a carrier deck, but a quiet room where chemists were staring at equations that most pilots would never see. What they discovered would become one of the most decisive, yet least talked about technological shifts of the Pacific War. A team of fuel specialists from the Bureau of Aeronautics had been studying a peculiar truth. American engines were no longer limited by metal, they were limited by chemistry. The mighty R-2800 could handle brutal pressures. Its pistons, rods, and cylinders had been engineered far beyond the stress values they ever experienced in flight, but the fuel feeding it simply couldn't survive the detonation forces required to unlock that hidden power. The solution came from an unlikely angle: a new blend of fuel additives, aromatic compounds, anti-knock agents, and stabilizers that could push American gasoline from the standard 100/130 octane to something far more explosive. It would be called 100/150 octane fuel, and it was unlike anything the Japanese had. At this new rating, the Hellcat's engine, previously restrained, could suddenly operate at wartime emergency power levels that had only existed on engineering drafts. The numbers were stunning. With 100/150 octane, the R-2800 wasn't just stronger, it behaved like a different beast entirely. Higher manifold pressures, sharper throttle response, a brutally fast initial climb that caught even seasoned test pilots off guard. Test logs at Naval Air Station Patuxent River recorded reactions that bordered on disbelief. One pilot wrote simply, "This can't be the same airplane." But speed was only half the story. The real revolution was in how the Hellcat accelerated, especially in that critical 20 seconds pilots had been losing to the Zero. With the new fuel mix, those 20 seconds changed completely. The Hellcat no longer lagged behind. It lunged forward, climbed harder, bit into the air with a violence the Zero simply couldn't match. Engineers realized they had created something unprecedented. A heavy American fighter that could out-accelerate Japan's most agile lightweight machine. But the fuel alone wasn't enough. It had to reach the Pacific, thousands of miles away, across submarine-infested waters, without losing stability or breaking down in storage. So chemists reformulated it again and again. They created versions resistant to heat, humidity, and the brutal conditions of carrier logistics. Each test brought them one step closer to unleashing the Hellcat's full potential. By mid-1943, the formula was ready. The barrels were stamped, the orders were signed, and the Pacific Fleet prepared to field a Hellcat unlike any the Japanese had ever encountered. The Americans weren't just upgrading a fighter. They were rewriting the physics of the opening seconds of air combat.
The first combat squadrons to receive the new fuel didn't quite know what to expect. They were told the Hellcat would perform better. They were told to watch manifold pressures carefully. But no one said outright, this fuel will change the way you fight. The transformation revealed itself in the most unforgiving place possible, a real dogfight over the Pacific. The Japanese struck first, diving from above with a pack of Zeros, executing the same tactic that had given them the advantage since 1941. Normally, American pilots would brace themselves for a desperate defensive climb. Not this time. As the Zeros came screaming down, an American section leader shoved the throttle forward, past the mark he normally would have respected. The Hellcat didn't choke. It didn't hesitate. It exploded forward. Pilots describe the feeling as a punch in the back, a sudden surge that launched the aircraft upward faster than their instincts expected. The Zeros overshot. Their perfect angle of attack dissolved in seconds. For the first time, the Americans weren't reacting. They were counterattacking. One Hellcat pulled into a steep climb, something no pilot would have attempted against a Zero just months earlier. But instead of stalling or falling behind, the Hellcat kept gaining. The Zero tried to follow and failed. The American pilot rolled over the top, dove back down, and fired a burst that shredded the Japanese fighter. It was over in seconds. Word spread quickly across the fleet. Pilots began comparing notes, talking late into the night about how the Hellcat felt different, how it jumped forward when they pushed the throttle, how they could now match the Zero's opening acceleration and sometimes exceed it. The Japanese noticed it too. Their pilots reported Hellcats climbing at angles they had never seen. They complained that the Americans were gaining speed too quickly, that the heavy one accelerates like a light fighter now. For the first time in the war, Zero pilots lost their sacred comfort zone, the first 30 seconds of engagement. Without that edge, the Zero became what it had always secretly been, deadly only when it controlled the fight, fragile when it didn't. The Hellcat didn't just close the gap, it flipped the script entirely, and the Japanese were suddenly fighting a very different war in the sky. The turning point came on a humid morning over the Philippine Sea, when a group of Hellcats launched for what they expected to be a routine patrol. It didn't stay routine for long. Radar operators aboard the carrier intercepted a massive inbound formation, more than 24 Zeros sweeping low and fast, clearly hunting the U.S. fleet. The Hellcats turned toward the threat. They were outnumbered at least 2-1. Previously, this would have been a nightmare. This time, the pilots felt something they hadn't felt before: confidence. The Americans opened their throttles. The new fuel roared to life. The Hellcats surged ahead. The Japanese, relying on their usual plan, climbed early to secure the high ground, only to realize the Hellcats weren't falling behind. They were closing the distance, fast. One American pilot later wrote, "It felt like we'd been unchained." The first merge happened in a flash. A pair of Zeros swooped down from the right, expecting slow American reactions. But the Hellcats snapped into a climb, using every ounce of power from the 100-150 fuel. With the extra horsepower, the Hellcats didn't just evade, they reversed positions. In less than 5 seconds, the hunters became the hunted. One Hellcat rolled over and fired a burst that tore off a Zero's wing. Another dove straight through the formation, ripping apart its center. The sky erupted into a swirling, chaotic dogfight. But amid the chaos, one pattern became undeniable. The Zeros could no longer dictate the fight. Every time a Zero tried to climb out of danger, a Hellcat climbed with it.
Every time a Zero tried to accelerate out of reach, a Hellcat matched the move and closed the gap. The Japanese pilots began to panic. Their radios crackled with warnings. "The heavy ones are climbing. The heavy ones are accelerating." One American pilot described it simply: "For once, the Zero had no escape door." After 15 minutes of combat, the result was overwhelming. Outnumbered Hellcats shot down Zeros in rapid succession, clean, precise kills, while suffering almost no losses. When the Hellcats returned to the carrier, deck crews stared at the scorched paint around the exhausts, signs of just how hard the engines had been pushed. Yet the machines held, the fuel held, and the results spoke for themselves. That day, U.S. commanders realized something the Japanese hadn't yet discovered. Their fighters were no longer evenly matched. The Hellcat, once dismissed as slow, had become the apex predator of the Pacific sky. In the months that followed, Japanese pilots kept reporting the same unsettling pattern. The Hellcat was no longer the predictable, lumbering opponent they once mocked. It climbed harder, it hit faster, it dictated the terms of every fight. Across the Pacific, kill ratios told the story more clearly than any propaganda ever could. The F6F Hellcat achieved one of the most lopsided records in aviation history: over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, at a kill ratio approaching 19-1. And at the center of that transformation wasn't a new wing or a new engine or some secret allied weapon. It was fuel. Fuel that pushed the engine harder. Fuel that let American pilots fight on their own terms. Fuel that turned a slow aircraft into a Zero killer. By the war's end, Japanese intelligence finally understood what had happened. One captured pilot summed it up bitterly: the Americans changed the rules. That change didn't come from luck. It came from adaptation, engineering creativity, and the willingness to push a machine beyond what anyone thought possible. So what does this story really teach us? Here are the 3 lessons the Hellcat left behind. Lesson 1. The enemy's assumptions are your greatest weapon. The Japanese believed the Hellcat was slow, so they never prepared for a faster one. Lesson 2. Small changes can produce massive shifts. A new fuel mix, just a number on a drum, changed the balance of power in the Pacific. Lesson 3. When you control the pace, you control the fight. Speed isn't just movement, it's initiative, confidence, and dominance. In the end, the Hellcat story isn't about luck or miracle engineering. It's about how one overlooked machine, given the right boost, became unstoppable. And the next time someone tells you something is too slow, too old, or not good enough, remember what happened when America poured the right fuel into the Hellcat. If you enjoyed this story and want more forgotten chapters of WWII aviation, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me which aircraft you want next.